Hi, everyone, and welcome again to yet another episode of Gaudium et Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. Quick little note. I was informed by my listeners, at least on the audio Podbean of my last podcast, that there was a 30-second ad at the beginning of it, which I find greatly annoying, and I have something sent out to Podbean to deal with that because it gives the impression that I have monetized this blog, and I have not, and I refuse to monetize it. So my apologies for that annoyance, and we'll find out why Podbean is doing that. But anyway, I'm very excited to have a guest. I was supposed to have on here a couple weeks, but Zoom was acting up. A couple weeks ago, I should say, Zoom was acting up. It's Dr. Nathanael Blake, and we are here to discuss his new book out from Ignatius Press, and I've kind of become a quasi-podcaster for Ignatius Press, so thank you, Ignatius. But the title of the book, for those just listening, is Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. It also has a lovely foreword by Ryan Anderson, but for those viewing, here it is. I'll hold it up. It's a nice little blue cover. Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. Well, thank you, Dr. Blake, for being here today to discuss this very important book.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I should like to say that Dr. Blake is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a regular columnist for the Federalist, World Opinions, and other popular publication. Got his doctorate at the Catholic University of America. Lives in Virginia with his wife and his children. I was once a seminarian for the Diocese of Arlington, so I know Northern Virginia well. I assume you live in Northern Virginia somewhere.
About as far out in Northern Virginia as we can get.
That is a wise move because what is Northern Virginia keeps creeping out, though, further and further. Um, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. Let's dig right into your book, which is really about the sexual revolution. And I'll preface this by saying, look, I'm 66 years old. I'm a child of the 60s and 70s. Those are my formative years, and I went to public school in those years. My parents could not afford Catholic school with all the little kids they had. And so off to public school I went, and this was in Nebraska, conservative Nebraska, and yet we were exposed to what I can only, in retrospect, call the indoctrination of the sexual revolution from our teachers and fellow classmates in the 60s and the 70s. So I was thinking, this would be we'll start with what now looks rather tame and domesticated, the sexual revolution as it got started in the 60s, and then sort of work our way forward. If that's an amenable starting point for you, let's put the first question this way: when do you think this thing that we call the sexual revolution got started, and why?
Well, the easy answer is the 60s. The other easy answer is when our forefathers sinned. And ever since then, we've wanted to keep sinning too. But
Yeah.
I would say, particularly, the point where there was a shift was that our inclination to sin got a real turbocharge from two things, the pill and penicillin. Because all of a sudden it seemed like we could get away with it. Jennifer Morse put it that way, talking about the book to me, and I love that. I wish I'd put it in the book because it's so simple and so accurate. We thought that the consequences of human sexuality, which are real, and if we indulged wrongly, would be manifest very clearly. There's a reason all those warnings about caring for widows and orphans are in the Bible, is because people who are fatherless, women who did not have a man to help protect them in that culture for most of human history, were very vulnerable. But now it seemed like we were rich enough, we were technologically advanced enough that suddenly we could do what we wanted. So I would say there's certainly an ideological component, but also simply the material prosperity and technological prowess that made it seem like, yes, we could get away with this.
Yeah, that's so I think that's so very true because there was always, for sex outside of marriage, there was always the threat of you might get pregnant. And then what do you do? And then, of course, there was also the threat of sexually transmitted diseases that could not be cured. And so, that what was the old saying? God forgives, but nature punishes. and,
That
and so, and that was front and center in that kind of thing. So, yeah, along comes antibiotics, along comes the pill, and all of a sudden, a consequence-based ethic uh, doesn't do it anymore. Does that not point, though, to and this is a point that I want to get to with regard to the beginnings of the sexual revolution, that most of the people that sort of succumbed to it were, at least initially in our culture, some semblance of a Christian, uh, church-going people who suddenly start thinking that, sex outside of marriage is no big deal. And a lot of it had to do with the fact, like you just pointed out, that the consequences one way. So does this not point to a kind of failure on the part of the churches to teach a holistic vision of sexuality that emphasized the reasons, the theological, moral, and spiritual and psychological reasons why we should reserve sex to marriage, rather than simply a pinched up sort of white knuckled chastity in order to avoid bad consequences?
I think so. And I quote a few people, Stefan Zweig, who's actually a Jewish writer in Vienna, Austria. But his comment about people who'd long ago ceased to believe in the devil and barely believed in God really resonated as a description of this class of people who were still respectable, but it was respectability, not virtue necessarily. So there was certainly that. And then there was a lot of, well, I think now we're seeing a lot of people surprised at just how many harmful consequences there still have been because they thought, well, pregnancy that you don't want or disease, that's the only problem. And then, no, there's a lot of other things that have run through our culture. Uh,
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of forms the spine of the thesis of this entire book, which is that, okay, we got rid of those consequences in theory, pregnancies that we don't want and, diseases that we don't want. And yet, a point of fact, after the introduction of the pill, which created a kind of licentiousness and a sort of libertinism in our
oh
culture,
dear.
you saw unwanted pregnancies explode, which is then you get the fallback of abortion. And you actually saw STDs explode too, which is suddenly in our consciousness came, well, now we need to practice safe sex and so on.
Mhm.
But then there's also a whole set of other consequences of sexual libertarianism that emerge. Divorce, breaks up break families. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, on the subject of divorce, I say that the best anti-poverty program, the best educational program, the best anti-crime program would be an end to fatherlessness. So, fathers married the mothers of their children and then stayed with them. So, yes, there have been all these other consequences, but what we've seen is that the outgrowths of sin don't just attack us in the most obvious ways. So, we talked about, again, disease, but it also attacks our soul. And you mentioned how we saw an explosion in some of these things, and that's because it changed the nature of how people were having sex. So, as sex is less reserved for marriage, I mean, it was never perfectly practiced, of course, but as that norm fades, suddenly people are having sex in situations in relationships or a lack of relationship where if the woman gets pregnant, an abortion is almost automatic. Ryan Anderson, my boss at EPPC, author of several great books, you mentioned it, but he's been screaming for a couple of years now since the Dobbs decision that we can't uncouple our uh, response to abortion from the question of marriage because marriage is the great protector of unborn human life. He's something like 90+% of abortions are done on unmarried women. So that's
Yeah.
what we see. And the irony, of course, is that also as relationships degrade, and this is something Brad Wilcox has been at pains to point out, University of Virginia sociologist, people actually are reporting having less sex. But the sex that they are having, because it is uncommitted increasingly, is more likely to result in abortion.
That's interesting and fascinating. I mean, when I was growing up, And, 1973, we get Roe v. Wade, and the great debates ensue about abortion. Of course, uh, one of the accusations that was always hurled against the Catholic Church and people like myself was, well, if you people would just allow for easier access to contraception, then there wouldn't be any abortions now, would there? Because unwanted pregnancies would just somehow mysteriously vanish. And yet, the irony, of course, is that those two things end up being linked because, like you said, of the changed nature of how we're having sex. To that end, I would say this, and I don't want to dominate the conversation. Part of the problem, it seems to me, and it sort of comes out in your book, is the presumption that the sex act is kind of rational, and it's part of our rational faculty. It's planned and easy to control and so forth. When in point of fact, it's rather wild. It's untamed. Sex, especially in young people, the old-fashioned drive-in theater, backseat of the car, whatever. It's frequently spontaneous. It's frequently irrational. It's frequently quite ill-advised and quite stupid. And yet people engage in it anyway, dangerously and raucously and flamboyantly because it's fun. Okay, fun for the moment. And so there's a subtle, what I call simply a stupid psychology or a stupid anthropology that undergirds the sexual revolution, is this thing that we can manage and control.
Well, I would add to that, perhaps drawing on C.S. Lewis, that we think it can be managed and controlled without developing the virtues and the community, enforcing the community norms that would manage and control it. We expect people to be very responsible, but only in terms of health and safety. That's how we view responsibility. And so then abolition of man is famous thing. Men without chests. We cut out all of that element of spiritedness, to start mixing my metaphors and go to Plato. But you know, we take away all of these virtues, the reinforcing, and we just go straight from everything in between the head and then down lower gets cut out until you get to the passion. And yeah, so it cuts both ways in a weird way. We expect people to be rational, but only rational. And then at the same time, the sexual revolutionaries insist that it is sub-rational in the sense of it's your authentic self. It's the core of your inner being, but you can still be rational, at least in the sense of health and safety. And it's very inconsistent.
Yeah, I love that allusion to C.S. Lewis, and that's kind of what I was hinting. I mean, Lewis says in The Abolition of Man that the mind rules the belly through the chest, which is to
Mhm.
say, the mind deals with those visceral and elemental impulses and instincts we have through what Plato called the thumos, or that range of virtues that have to be developed in the heart and the chest and the affectations of life that control those visceral elements. And the family and all the institutions of society traditionally were geared towards building those virtues, sometimes hypocritically, of course, inconsistently, but that was the goal. So you end up then with a culture without any emphasis on virtue. So I'd like your comment, because the entire book, I think, has a pretext to it, and it's a brilliant pretext, and it needs to be shouted from the rooftops. And I hope everybody buys this book, reads it, gives it to their teenage children, whatever. It is that sexual morality matters. Doggone it, it matters. And so one of the most things that irritates me the most is I read certain things in Catholic literature. Say they'll talk about sexual. Even I see this even from very Orthodox Catholics. Will say, "Oh, that's a pelvic issue. Oh, those are pelvic issues. Oh, those are even Pope Francis said the issues that are below the belt and below the waist." I thought, really, seriously, that's what we've come to, even as a church, to just dismiss the importance of sexual morality like that.
Yeah, well, I would say two things. First of all, these issues matter. Uh, Firstly, because they're not just about us. They're about how we relate to other people, how we treat other people, how we regard them, how we regard ourselves. A whole lot of things are bound up in pelvic issues, so-called, and it has a great deal of effect on society. I argue that there is no social justice without the pursuit of sexual righteousness. But the other point that I would make is that, yes, it's easy to say, oh, we need to be more concerned about spiritual sins. But a lot of times I've seen people fall into spiritual sin starting because of sexual sin. Because unrepentant sin, even if it is a sin of the flesh rather than of the spirit or whatever, if it is not repented of, if it is excused, will lead to those spiritual sins, which presumably the people who are dismissive of concerns about the pelvis would say we need to be concerned about pride and hypocrisy, all of these things. But if we ignore those sins of the flesh, we will also be led to ignore the sins of the spirit.
I couldn't agree more. I think that is so true. The virtues all kind of hang together in their own way. They're not these little isolated things. You can say, well, that virtue can exist separate from that virtue. No, they're all part of a tapestry. We need kind of a recovery of St. Thomas Aquinas's account of the virtues, his faculty psychology and stuff, which I think does a brilliant job of pointing out how all of these virtues are so profoundly interrelated. One only has to look, and we can talk about this a little bit. One only has to look at sort of the sin of pornography and how absolutely addictive it can become and destructive in the lives of so many people. And it can lead to a kind of secretive double life where a person is able to hide this addiction and so forth, even though it afflicts them terribly. The idea that this can be compartmentalized and tamed and not have it affect the other areas of my life seems to me to be very psychologically and morally naive.
It is. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that this is really afflicting perhaps the younger men among us and even boys, because pornography has changed. And I think some people who are older don't quite realize how much it's changed. It's not just pictures of naked women in Playboy anymore. Not that that was good, but
Yeah,
it's now much more degrading, much more violent, and much more accessible. So we even have The Guardian just a day or two ago, left-wing British newspaper, publishing a piece about the alarming rise of choking during sex.
saw that.
Sexual strangulation is now normalized among young people. And that's entirely driven by pornography, which, for various reasons, has become more extreme, more violent, more degrading. And I think that has to do with the nature of the medium, insofar as it is unable to actually even simulate genuine intimacy with another person. So instead, it leans into the extremes of what it can visually depict. And, more taboos it breaks, the more likely it is you get a response. And then, of course, those who are most addicted are the most likely to pay to consume this. So both its business model and its psychological model push it to extremes, and then young men become uh, inculcated in this. It becomes their sex education. And then young women find that horrifying in many cases. And so the sexes are driven apart. And I'm not trying to
Yeah.
downplay, adult men, married men who are addicted as well. But it really seems like our culture, even on the left, who culturally progressive people are noticing that something's gone very wrong in what porn is doing to young men.
It's very distorting, and it seems to me that it should be declared a public health crisis, a major public health issue, on a par with the hysteria over COVID and so forth 5 years ago. This to me is every bit the pathology. It didn't kill biologically, although it could lead to that. It just strikes me how destructive it is. And you look at places. I read something not too long ago about Japan and Japan suffering a demographic implosion and looking at millions and millions 50 years from now, their population cut by 40% or something. And the study indicated that one of the reasons is that young Japanese, it's not just they choose not to have children, they've chosen not to have sex, that the floor has fallen out of their sexual activity, and a lot of the blame goes on pornography, that they would prefer the sort of sexual satisfaction that comes from watching porn to actual the work that goes into developing actual relationships with other people.
Yeah, I mean, and that brings my mind back to C.S. Lewis and the third in his book in his space trilogy, That Hideous Strength, discussing the inhabitants of the moon as a, in this science fiction novel who, yes, had done that same thing as an entire culture. And it was presented as something just utterly horrifying and alien, but it is, in fact, coming to be an increasingly normal part of people's lives in our world, not just in fiction. So, yeah. And then, of course, the demographic decline is one of the effects of the sexual revolution. We're starting to see people be alarmed about that. And then just the lack of sex. It's one of the great ironies, although predictable, is that the sexual revolution has reduced the amount of sex people are having. And, if you've been to a baptism lately, do you reject Satan and his empty promises? Well, there's a reason we describe it as empty because they are. Sin doesn't deliver what it promises to give us. And so the end result is uh, unbridled sexuality without ungoverned by virtue, unbounded by the natural law, ends up leading to less sex because it destroys the relationships that actually make sex that sex is meant for and that make it something that is a unitive act of two people who love each other are giving themselves to each other. So all of those beautiful things in the Christian understanding of sexuality between a man and his wife are gone. Instead, there's selfishness, and people flee from that at a certain point because it's no longer enjoyable. The pleasure is gone. There's just the pain, the exploitation.
Well, absolutely. And that leads me, I mean, one of my favorite chapters of your book, and it's one of the earlier chapters, is called From Liberation to Loneliness. And it directly relates to what you were just talking about. So maybe you could talk about it. Why does sexual liberation lead us to loneliness?
Well, I mean, just picking again on news articles that just came out. The New Yorker has a piece on in the last few days or so from when we're recording this on how is Gen Z having enough sex and warning about the sex recession, which has been going on. Warnings about that have been going on for years. I cited an Atlantic piece from a half decade or so ago. But it's true. And the reason again is it's actually really hard to sustain a active sex life without another person. And it's really hard, I think. Haven't tried it myself, but I think it's probably really hard right now to just churn through sexual partners. So, I mean, a few rich and famous people can do it, I suppose, but practically speaking, if you want to have sex, you need to be with somebody in a at least semi-committed relationship. And of course, the Christians say, well, just go ahead and commit, make those beautiful promises to, lifelong vows. But even in the worldly perspective that is simply concerned with getting sexual pleasure, having regular sex, you still need commitment. But they also want to keep their options open, right? It's that contradiction of do what you want while at the same time, so the safety of commitment without the actual commitment, the security without actually paying anything for it. And it doesn't work. And that's what we're seeing is people are not forming relationships. They are hurting each other. Men and women are being really directed away from each other. It's incredible how much of the internet is just men and women who are angry at each other, usually not talking to each other, but men talking amongst themselves, women talking amongst themselves about how hard it is out there to find a decent man or a decent woman.
Yeah, so very true. I mean, I have been retired from the professorate now for about 10 years, a little longer now, actually. I'm getting old. But even when I was still teaching, I always made it a point in some of my classes to give a lecture on the evils of pornography and why it was bad and why the sex revolution leads to loneliness and broken relationships and everything you're talking about in here. And I can't tell you how many times after I would give that lecture and I'd keep my office door open and students would file in droves, for the rest of the day, the rest of the week, mainly girls, young women, who would say to me, Dr. Chapp, you have no idea. It is so hard to find a date with a guy who isn't hopelessly addicted to porn or who doesn't simply just want to engage in certain sexual practices that I don't want to do. That I just can't have a relationship with somebody because their sexual imaginary is so tainted. Uh, and that, I mean, how isolating is that? How lonely for those young women.
Yeah, and I also, I mean, I don't talk about this as much in the book, but I suspect a fair amount of the hookup culture that does happen is just the desire to connect with someone on the part of young women, even if they won't enjoy the sexual part of it. It's simply, I mean, they really just need a hug. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah,
they
absolutely.
just want to feel wanted and connected, and the sex is just they put up with it just for that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's loud and clear. I think that comes through. Let's move on to talk about abortion. I mean, your chapter on abortion is called Abortion Hardens the Hearts. It doesn't stop. Could you explain that?
Yes, it's that we know what abortion does to a human being. This is the age of ultrasound. We have all seen the little pictures that we print out and put on our fridge, post on social media. We've seen the little videos of, baby waving tiny arms and moving in utero. But because it is the age of ultrasound in particular, and we know what abortion does, we know that it is killing a human life. That does something to us as well, individually, to those who participated, but more broadly to all of us as a culture are affected by the fallout of a decision to deliberately turn what should be the solidarity of the fundamental social unit, mother, father, and child, into a battleground of competing selfish interests, and to resolve that violently, bloodily, with somebody dying. That affects everything. Our politics, our law, but also our culture, our dating scene. Of course, that comes back. We're just talking about young women. Well, young women dating in this world, having sex in this world without commitment, they know what's expected of them. They're the ones who, if something goes wrong, have to go out and get rid of it, do something about it. This affects how young men treat women. And of course, it affects the relationships parents have to their children. A lot of abortions, I think a majority actually, are procured by women who already have children. How does that then change how they view their own children, whom they're already caring for? So, all these reverberations throughout society, and all of them make us more calloused as a culture and as individuals.
So that's so true. I remember I once knew a man who had 7 kids. It was when I knew him, he was older and his kids were all grown. I remember that he was having a conversation with one of his daughters, and she just came out and said, "Well, I have no intention of ever having children, and and I've already had a couple abortions. I think you should know that, Dad." And he sort of just took it in stride. And he said, "Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Geez, I would have liked to have seen my grandchildren or whatever." And then the daughter shot back. I was right there. She said, "Well, Dad, I just don't want to become a baby machine like Mom was." To which the father turned to her and said, "Oh, really? And which one of your siblings do you wish we could turn back and give away?" And she had no response to that because she loved her siblings, right? And at
Yeah.
that point, she was forced to acknowledge my brothers and sisters are a gift, not a burden. And this is what gets lost in the tragedy of abortion is that an unborn child is not treated as a gift, but as this burdensome, horrible thing that you have to harden your heart to.
Yeah. And it's often, I think, any of us who are parents or, those of us who are parents and love our children recognize that yeah, children are work, but it is wonderful. They are the great blessing of life. And I mean, one of the greatest blessings in this life is to spend time with your children and to love them and be loved by them. And also, with regard to the whole baby making machine, that really speaks to a culture that regards womanhood as a problem, right? So, and I talk about how we have this cultural ideal of the autonomous self, the self who is unencumbered by burdens, unencumbered by unchosen obligations, and consequently is free to move in and out of relationships, situations, jobs, whatever, as he or she sees fit. But because human reproduction is asymmetrical, those burdens are not equal. If this is the normative ideal of what it is to be human, then women would seem to be less than human unless they can somehow repress their own natural fertility. Their own bodies become the enemy that keeps them from achieving full autonomous personhood. And of course, children, because they are vulnerable and dependent, and never more so than in the womb, and those burdens in the womb cannot be passed on to anyone else, really. Children in the womb seem a threat to the very personhood of the mother, all because we have this ideal of humans as free, autonomous individuals, which from a Christian perspective is
Yeah.
false. We're not defined by autonomy, but by our dependence on God, our to God, and our love for God and love for others.
Oh, absolutely. It's beautifully put. And an abortion undermines all of that. I mean, at the bottom line, of course, it does all of that because it's a heinous evil. It is the taking of an innocent, the deliberate taking of an innocent human life. So I go back to my criticism earlier of, oh, those are just merely pelvic issues and talking about extramarital sex or whatever. You now find a concomitant sort of dismissal of abortion as an important issue by those Catholics who would say, well, those are just culture war issues. You're just engaging in culture wars. We need to pay attention to climate change and immigration and social justice on a whole range of other fronts, and not just single issue abortion. But in my experience, and I believe I'm a big believer in the seamless garment of life ethic. I'm not here to dismiss the importance of social justice. I mean, I run a Catholic worker farm, for crying out loud. That's not my point. My point is that all too often this is mere rhetoric in order to dismiss the foundational and fundamental moral importance of fighting abortion.
I agree that I think it tends to be a smokescreen. And I would also say that uh, again, with pelvic issues and in particular with abortion, one, you will not have social justice. You can't have solidarity with all of these other groups of people that, we're supposed to have solidarity with if you're denying the fundamental solidarity of a mother and her child. It's not
Yeah.
going to happen. And I would additionally say that we face we also have the problem of if we want women to be loved as women, as I was just talking about, we have to accept the realities of human reproduction. It doesn't mean, women just stay home and make babies or whatever Handmaid's Tale dystopia people want to spin up, but it does mean recognizing that men and women are different. That's fundamentally part of who we are. This is important, and that if this complementarity should be a cause for love. It should call love from us rather than disdain for perceived weakness or dependence or vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because if you're calling that, again, you're not going to have solidarity for anyone else or love or compassion
Yeah.
for anyone else.
Yeah. And once again, to go back to the interconnectedness of all the virtues. And how it's very disingenuous to say, well, I'm in favor of social justice. I'll let other people deal with abortion, and they treat abortion as just this intractable issue that has to be dealt with individual and not something of broad social implication. I'd also like to comment on and have you comment on, I mean, the fundamental sort of rationale behind free and legal and widespread abortion. We just saw in the UK, for example, abortion now right up to the moment of birth and somewhat beyond, in unlimited way with no restrictions. And so, this is the way we're all headed. The principle, of course, is my body, my choice. And I've often heard, women say things like, they just don't have any experience of somebody else telling them what to do with their bodies. And yet that's empirically false. I don't know what you'd call the military draft and dragging your sorry butt out and throwing it on Normandy Beach in front of German bullets against your will. If not somebody telling you what to do with your body. And by the way, if you object to being so drafted, well, then we're going to throw you in jail for a certain amount of time. And we'll take your body and put it in a place that you don't want it to be. There's also the fact, that, oh, well, women were so burdened back in the old days because pregnancy was dangerous. And so we have to give women autonomy in order to be fully liberated, not to suffer the dangers of 5, 6, 7 pregnancies. Yeah, I would point out the fact that men too, during that era, mostly in blue collar jobs, going down into the coal mines, going out into the forests to do forestry, doing police and fire work. These are extremely dangerous professions where men were routinely harmed and killed and suffering long-term damage like the coal miners with their black lung and so forth. To so portray the life of men in that era as this idyllic, well, they got to go and work in the workforce while women were at home pushing out little babies is such a disservice to men. And that, you have that chapter, then the disappearance of men and women, and it just seems to me that part of this is an erasure of history, an erasure of anthropology, an erasure of what the reality actually was in the trenches of what men had to do, what women had to do, and so forth. And now it's being replaced with this grand mythology of this sexless, bodiless, almost Gnostic understanding of sexual difference. That's a
Yes,
more of a ramble than a question, but you can go ahead.
I can go from there. I mean, yes, life was hard and difficult for men and women, and also men and women for most of human history were much more intertwined in household production. Sort of this post-industrial revolution, middle class thing where the man goes off and the woman stays home. That was a historical anomaly. The truth was, for most of human history, people worked and lived in a very close proximity, and everyone was involved in keeping the household provided because that was a lot of work. It was dangerous for men, it was dangerous for women, uh, often in different ways. But the thing about that was what would have been best in all of this, amidst the danger, amidst the difficulties, amidst the hardships and all of that, is that it was a unity of love. And this was always what Christianity pointed us to, is that love of husband and wife, which again is represented in the Old Testament, God for the people of Israel, in the New Testament, Christ in his church, this union, this love for your children who are received as blessings. So it's always, from a Christian perspective, about love, not about selfish shirking of the dangers. But now, yes, you brought up the sexless person, and that's the ideal now. Of course, if women are shedding womanhood, if men are shedding a lot of masculinity and manhood, then we're just autonomous individuals, and our bodies are just a matter of plumbing, really, that is incidental. And consequently, because it doesn't have intrinsic meaning, it can be changed per our whims. And that brings us to gender ideology and its many evils.
Yeah. Yes. Well, let's talk about those many Eve. I was just going to say, we can now change that plumbing. We can surgically alter that plumbing, and more than the plumbing, we can use medications to suppress hormones and replace them with other hormones, and the list goes on and on and on. What is the ultimate aim of transgenderism?
Well, I think that there are, I would distinguish a bit between two classes here, possibly three. But first, I would say those who I view much more as victimized by this ideology, and that would particularly be young women. It's We are all aware that a lot of adolescent or teenage girls or young women will have periods of unhappiness, of depression. My understanding is that junior high is an ugly time for young women. Have not
Yeah.
experienced that myself directly, but I've been told. And so a lot of young women, and then we throw in porn culture, social media and stuff, a lot of young women want to opt out. And that's why we've seen this explosion, not just in young people identifying as transgender and non-binary, but particularly young women who prior to adolescents showed no interest in this, showed no signs of distress over their gender or their sexed body. And it's simply it's a replacement for cutting, for anorexia, for being goth, whatever. All of these old ways of trying to opt out, of trying to express difference and discontent. Well, now the promise is you can be a different person. You're unhappy because you were born in the wrong body, and we can change your body. So those are those I would say those people, especially the young women, although young men get caught up in it too. Those are the ones I view as victims. The ones that I view as the victimizers are not just the doctors and the activists pushing it, but the ideologues who really do believe that human beings need to be self-creating, that our uh, embodied existence is a sort of prison, and it gets very Gnostic in its perspective here. But that our very embodiment is imprisoning, and liberation means the ability to remake our physical selves to the greatest extent possible in accordance with whatever whims we have for whatever reason.
Oh, so very true. And so much confusion. I just I think you're absolutely correct to see in it a kind of ideologically driven thing. It's just really hard for me to get my mind around the fact that something that would have been classified as child abuse 20 years ago is now considered gender affirming care. I mean, seriously, to take a 10-year-old boy who has expressed a desire to wear pink dresses and play with dolls and say, okay, well, he's a girl, and to genetically mutilate him and then give him puberty blockers and so forth. This strikes me as demonic. I'm just going to say it strikes me as a demonic assault on the innocence of the young, and a form of not just a child abuse, an extreme form of child abuse that cuts right to the child's inner identity.
I'm not going to disagree with that. I think it is horrible, and we are thankfully seeing that it took that level of evil to finally get a lot of people to notice and to start standing up, because there thankfully has been a lot of pushback. Of course, there was the Skermeti case that just came down from the Supreme Court saying that states can restrict these so-called treatments for children,
Yeah.
but there's a lot still to go. But I do think you're right that, and the reason I would say behind that assault on children, other than, you know, demonic forces and just evil's hatred for innocence, is that the arguments that were used to advance the broader LGBT agenda necess necessitated dragging children into this, right? The whole born this way argument that, there's a Lady Gaga song about it. It was great PR, sort of this pseudo-natural law argument. This is just who I am, so let me be. It's not true, but the success of that argument at a popular level meant that the children were always going to be involved, because if children are born this way, then it does excuse all of these treatments, all the sexualization, etc. But it also means that if this is the authentic self of children from birth, well, we have to affirm that self. Or the whole argument that was used for same-sex marriage and so on necessarily led to this point.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think that is so true. There are so many deep, just philosophical, theological problems with the born that way argument. And I want to sort of end our conversation today talking about the LGBTQ movement and the gay marriage and so forth. But I want to come back to transgenderism and kids. Uh, the fact is that little kids are born. First off, I don't think kids are born transgender. Let's just get, but let's stipulate for the sake of argument. Okay, they are. Uh, Kids are born with all kinds of things that we would not consider to be good. I
Yeah.
myself had a sister. I had a sister who died at age 5 because she was born with a severe congenital heart defect that when they went in to try and fix it, they
Mhm.
ended up killing her. All right.
Mm.
And nobody would have argued, well, she was born with that bad heart, so you're wrong to go in and engage in reparative therapy to try and fix it. All right. I mean, there's all kinds of things where, some kids are born blind, or,
Mhm.
therefore we're going to have to try and fix that blindness. Maybe we can cure that blindness and so forth. The presumption is that everything that I'm born with is necessarily from God and good because it's natural, because I'm born with it, strikes me as one of the most absurd arguments ever made.
It is a terrible argument. And also, with regard to sexual desire, it's a terrible argument where it originated. Because the fact that you have a desire for something does not mean it's good for you to indulge that desire
Yeah.
or indulge it in whatever way you see fit. But yeah, and of course, there's also a great deal of metaphysics behind this presupposition that you can somehow be born into the wrong body. That involves an awful lot of assumptions that were just swallowed by people. Um, but the real core of it is a rejection of any normativity about what it means to be human. That there is anything from God or from nature that we are to conform ourselves to that is what is good. And then, of course, applied to medicine, this reduces the doctor just to a technician instead of doctors being focused on restoring health, of being agents of healing. The doctor now is simply the very technical specialist who will do whatever you want to because your desires are the only standard of what it is to be healthy or unhealthy. So even if it's going to physically harm children, which is what all of these treatments do, from puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries, they're all physically harmful, but they are seen as nonetheless good because the only measurement of health at this point in this per this ideology is human desire.
Yeah, it boils down to desire, and whatever it wants, and that we can be self-made. To that end, I mean, let's switch then to the issue of homosexuality and the LG part of LGBTQ. I've never understood why bisexual liberation should be such an important thing. Like especially the church. You see Father James Martin talking about we need to be sensitive to LGBTQ people. What does it mean for the church to be sensitive to bisexuals? So, does it mean that we're now supposed to, have a man and his wife and his mistress come in, and I mean, and his gay lover come in, and we'll bless all three? I've never quite understood why it is that the church is supposed to be more tolerant towards bisexuals, but we'll set that aside. What is, the gay rights movement gets started with this emphasis upon, sexual orientation as this indelible thing that cannot be changed, that you're largely born with. You're either born with it through some genetic disposition, or you are psychologized, let's put it that way, or nurtured into it from a very, very early age. The point being that sexual orientation is rather entrenched and it is unchangeable, and therefore it is a central part of your identity. But I've also run across numerous, homosexuals, and reading homosexual writings and so forth, who would claim, oh no, but sexuality is this fluid thing. Orientation is very fluid. Pansexualism is a thing now, where yesterday I was attracted to girls. Next week I'm attracted to boys. Next week after that I'm attracted to both. Next week after that I'm attracted to kangaroos. You, all right.
Don't give them
So what?
ideas.
So what? What is it? I mean, I'm trying to get a handle on what it is that in a sense, to call them this, the opposition is thinking here. Is the current thinking amongst LGBTQ activists that sexual orientation is this entrenched, indelible identity, or is the thinking simply that it's this fluidity?
I think there's a split. I think that the movement united around the claim that it was intrinsic, it was immutable, it was innate, because that was an effective PR strategy. But we've now had, I quote, Lydia Palgren, a New York Times columnist, who came right out and said, I wasn't born this way. It just, developed over time. And there are plenty of other examples of people who are admitting that now. And she said, actually, it was just a temporary PR move that we need to get beyond now. So I think there are different individual experiences, and I think there are ideological differences, but there's certainly a large faction, at least, of the gay rights movement that does not believe born this way, innate, immutable, and instead recognizes that there's a lot more fluidity and so on to human sexuality. And they want to then they tend to be the more ideological ones. They want to then argue for this as something that is then going to destroy bourgeoisie norms of the family or whatever. Right, queerness, and it's interesting how queerness it was a descriptive term, then it became seen as a slur, and now it's something that's been embraced, usually as a political signifier, insofar as, well, it's not just about your sexuality, it's instead about opposition to any normative standards of
Yeah.
human sexuality.
That's what queer means now. It just means
Yeah.
outside the norm. Anything outside the norm. The
Hmm.
queering of this, the queering of that means the destruction of normativity.
Yeah. And so I really think that the other side doesn't quite know what it believes because it's not unified, but it is unified in opposition to a normative standard based on the difference between man and woman. And that's something that's the case even for those who would insist that homosexual desire is innate and immutable and unchanging. Because from a Christian perspective, okay, well, you're still called to chastity the way all of us are called to chastity.
Yeah.
And it might be more difficult because you don't have a legitimate outlet in marriage that you can pursue, but it's still what, every vowed religious is called to, for example, in the Catholic Church. Uh, so
Yeah.
from a Christian perspective, you're still supposed to be in control of your desires, aided by God's grace, because we are not ultimately called to define ourselves by our sexuality or our sexual desires.
Yeah. But that's what it reduces to. It's probably the case, right, that what we have amongst the homosexual group people, uh, it's probably a case where there are, for some, and I've known people like this, it does seem as if their so-called gayness or their homosexuality does seem rather entrenched. I mean, it's not like, well, I woke up yesterday and I was attracted to men, but, a week before that, I was attracted to women. No, it's like you hear stories where they will tell you from the earliest I can remember, I've been attracted to boys and so on. So there does seem to be that type. And then there's also this other type where it just seems to be fluid and sort of all over the map and things change, which means that I would say that laws against, so-called reparative therapy and so forth seem to me to be very short-sighted. Because if you're the kind of person who has same-sex inclinations and you don't want them, but you also recognize that your sexual desires are rather fluid and changeable, what would be wrong with seeking psychological therapy to sort of help you get over that fluidity?
Nothing. Well, and also you might not know precisely where you fall on that distinction until you try. I don't want to say that, oh, everyone can be, cured of same-sex attraction or something, because
Right,
that was
right.
something that was, uh, some Christians, especially evangelical Christians, went too far with a pray the gay away
Yeah,
or
you can
just
just pray
gets
it
the,
away. It's all okay. Yeah.
and the problem with that from a theological perspective is simply we're not going to be cured, or we're not going to have all temptations taken away from us in this life, whatever they are, whether they're
Yeah.
sexual or something else. So, but at the same time, it's certainly also false. Let's just say false, not just misguided, but false to say nobody's sexual orientation or attractions or desires can change, will ever change. They're fixed, they're immutable. And furthermore, even for people who will not perhaps ever get over sexual temptation, whether it's towards pornography, whether it's towards same sex relationships, whatever it is, therapy may still be very helpful to help them understand it, to cope with it, to manage their desires. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
certainly wrong to forbid therapists from talking with their patients about the goals that they have for
Yeah.
themselves and these
I,
conflicts between their religion and their sexual desire.
I agree. And, I'm not a huge fan of reparative therapy, pray the gay away. That can be, you hear stories about how destructive it can be psychologically to people raised in like these strict fundamentalist backgrounds and they grow up feeling awful about themselves. To that end, I'll say this in a positive way about the sort of gay rights movement. Is that I remember when I was a kid, you know, there were obviously young guys in my like you talk about junior high before. I remember junior high quite well, right? It's the coming out of puberty and so on. And I remember that there were some of my classmates who were clearly homosexual and were struggling with it. And I remember how viciously and cruelly they were treated by my classmates, the names that they were called, and even physically beat up and attacked, and so forth. And I consider it to be a tremendous positive social gain that we at least hopefully have moved beyond that kind of persecution of people who have sort of sexually different inclinations. And I consider that to be a tremendously good thing to have happened. I never want to see another young person who is questioning and struggling in their sexuality to be so abused as I saw in my youth. So that's a step forward. On the other hand, I consider it to be a form of abuse to simply throw in the towel and say, because of all of that, we now simply need to underwrite the sort of sexual libertarianism that the LGBTQ ideology sort of expresses, and that sort of anything goes. Because from where I sit, and I'll stop my ramble in a second, turn it over to you because you've already mentioned it, the church's counsel that people with those kinds of sexual, I'll call them dysfunctions or disorders, need to seek out the life of grace and in a life of lived sexual continence and chastity. That's not simply a form of oppression. You often hear, oh, that's cruel and so on. That's actually liberating. It's the best path forward, I think, for people like that. Let me put it that way. And maybe you can comment on that.
Well, I think it's, again, comes back to precisely what the nature of their inclinations. But for people who just have a fairly fixed same-sex attraction, yes, they're called to a life of chastity, and that is, it can be a cross to bear. But we are all called to that. I know people who are single into their 40s and are really struggling with this same thing of the call to chastity that seems to be lifelong. Well, I mean, we're all called to chastity, but specifically a call to celibacy
Yeah,
that seems to be lifelong, where there is no relationship or outlet. And that's difficult. At the same time, it is a witness to the world that we are not simply our sexual desires, that there is something higher and greater and better in this life. I mean, I talk a lot about in the book about the beauty of marriage and it as a symbol of Christ in the church and all of these wonderful things that I think are true. But there is also a very strong and profound witness in that life that of the single person, whether they're same-sex attracted or not, who is whether they are vowed religious or not, who is able to then show the culture there is something greater and higher in this world than my sexual indulgence, my sexual desires, because that is where we see uh, the beauty of Christianity is something that has a fulfillment beyond this world. Marriage is a fulfillment in this world, but it also directs us to our fulfillment beyond this world. Well, the life of celibacy uh, directs us even more directly to our fulfillment beyond this life.
boy, yeah, and this has an effect in on marriages as well. This isn't just about single people or homosexual people. People need to lead lives essentially of celibacy. I would recommend the book by Bishop Eric Varden on chastity, which I think is a wonderful book because the fact of the matter is, I think this lack of an understanding of the Christian virtue of chastity has harmed marriages as well. What sometimes only the married understand this, and sometimes those who have never been married don't understand this. Married life also involves sexual chastity. It's not as if married life is characterized, especially if been married 10, 15, 20 years, characterized, that every time the kids are gone, the husband and wife are at it, swinging from the chandeliers and making the roof rock. I mean, it's just not the way it is. And sometimes due to illness or the after effects of pregnancy and childbirth. So couples will have to go for quite a long time sometimes of refraining from sexual intercourse, or if the husband has to go overseas, say in military service, or for what you get the picture here. That I mean, there's even a word for it. Friends call it, the celibacy in the suburbs. That get married and be celibate. Ha 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 ha. But the fact is that marriage is so much more than simply the sexual act, and that even in marriage, chastity is required. Therefore, the lack of an understanding of what that is, I think, has also harmed sort of normal marriages.
Yes, I mean, I've seen certainly in some evangelical circles, not to keep picking on evangelicals all the time, but there have been preachers who have sort of taught almost that, the wife is a sexual plaything of the husband or something, and just very disrespectful and not. So that's obviously out. But yes, there are times of continence of self-sacrifice in marriage, and it again is centered on loving the whole person, the self-giving of love in marriage. Well, yes, that sex is part of that, but there's also a self-giving of giving of your own desires for a time, for whatever reason, of the self-giving of self-control, we might call it, of self-restraint. So those are certainly an element. And again, it directs us towards the two truths that I'm trying to get at it in my conclusion to the book, which is that Christianity does offer a better way of life. It avoids all of these pitfalls of sin. And so there are many benefits to living as God intended us to live. But at the same time, it's a fallen world. It's not, I'm not here to preach a sexual prosperity gospel or an emotional prosperity gospel of just be Christian and your sex life will be great and you won't have anxiety or marital conflict or anything. It's no that it's trying to balance those with a recognition that we are then directed towards Christ, because ultimately, marriage, our sexuality is meant to be fulfilled in marriage, and marriage is about love, and love is concerned with the good of others. And in that, it mirrors the love of Christ for all of us. The sacrifices and vulnerability that love requires of us in marriage are just a small reflection of the vulnerability and sacrifice of Christ and God's love for us through Christ, who came, suffered, and died for us. So nothing that we have to undertake in marriage, whether the good times or the bad times or the boring stretches where there's just dishes and diapers, is any harder than what Christ has endured for us. And so that is something that I think is comforting, it is strengthening, and again, directs us ultimately to look towards God.
Amen to that. Now, your book is called Victims of the Revolution. Who are the biggest victims of the revolution?
Well, we talked a lot about abortion, and I would say the children whose lives are discarded. But other than that, among the living, I would probably return to the young women who, well, they're doing well educationally, they're doing well economically, are just finding themselves unfulfilled and lonely and taking Prozac. And the numbers on that are horrifying. And it's because they're not being fulfilled, because it turns out accolades and accomplishments don't fulfill us. What fulfills us in this life and the next life, where it is expanded on, what fulfills us are people and love. So the love of others, the love of God. And that is what we are called to. Most of us are called to, in this life experience, our greatest loves through the vocations of marriage and family. That is what most of us are meant for in this life. And so without those, people are very lonely. And I think young women in particular may have had the worst of that.
What are the and I agree with that, by the way, and that was my experience as a professor as well in dealing with young people, that young women were more the victims of this in some ways than the young boys, although the men were afflicted and affected too. We're getting towards the end here, but I would be remiss if we didn't discuss, in a sense, the dark side of divorce and the destruction of the family that divorce creates, and in a sense that the victims here are children. We don't talk enough in our culture about how damaging divorce is to children. We speak more and more and more about actually the opposite, that somehow or another it's a shocking disregard of human freedom and joy and peace and so forth to even insinuate that two people don't have a right to walk their separate ways and that the kids are going to be just fine. How dare you? Blah blah blah. But the fact is, the sociological data are clear, right? This harms kids.
Oh, it's absolutely clear. And we've known for a long time, but the lure of adult independence, of adult autonomy, adult sexual indulgence has been so strong that we don't really want to talk about this as a culture very much. And I think I said earlier, but the truth is the best anti-poverty program, the best educational program, the best anti-crime program would just be fathers who marry the mothers of their children and stay married to them, because that would cure so many of our sociological ills. And it would also, for the budget conscious in the audience, just think about how much of our nation's wealth and technological prowess gets spent trying to ameliorate these problems that are caused by family breakdown. Um, so,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I titled the book Victims of the Revolution, and it's because we talk about victimhood a lot in our culture, but we don't talk about the victims of sexual choice, of sexual freedom
Yeah.
much.
Because let's get to the bottom. The sexual revolution represents a quasi religion. I mean, in the sense that you define religion functionally in terms of the sociology of religion and a functionalist approach to religion, then the sexual revolution provides us with a kind of ideological superstructure that kind of takes this on. And this gets entrenched in all of our elite institutions, the mass media. I mean, I think of poor Dan Quayle, the vice presidential candidate at the time, and I was never a big fan of Dan Quayle. That's not the point of this. He wasn't the brightest bulb, but he remember he criticized the show Murphy Brown that was on television because Candice Bergen, who played the character, got pregnant and she was single. And in a debate, Dan Quayle says, it doesn't help when we have TV shows, valorizing single parenthood like this. He was sent to the woodshed by every pundit in America. He was condemned as this intolerant jerk, this 1950s Leave It to Beaver nostalgic who just wants to roll back the clock. And yet Dan Quayle was right, wasn't he?
He was right. I mean, I grew up in the Clinton years, really. So
Yeah.
I don't remember Quayle as much, but I certainly remember Clinton and just the culture of the time. And yeah, but looking back, Quayle was right. And our culture would have been a lot better off if adults had simply restrained themselves. But you mentioned the sexual revolution as a quasi-religion, and it is because it has a normative account
Well,
of human
I don't mean
nature.
to interrupt you, but that's why I brought this up, the
Yeah.
Dan Quayle thing, because it acts then like an inquisition. You're not allowed to go against these dogmas,
Mm.
otherwise you're going to face the inquisition. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt,
It,
Dr. Blake. Go ahead.
yeah. No, no. Anyway, but yeah, so it does. It says you are meant to be autonomous, free, liberated, free of obligations except the ones you choose, and those come with an opt out somewhere in there. And you will be fulfilled and authentic and happy if you indulge your desires. That's a complete account of human nature. It's an account of what we are meant for, what gives us pleasure, what allows us to thrive in all of these things. And in all of it, it cuts against the church's teaching on who we are, what we are meant for, and how we are fulfilled, which is we're not fulfilled. We don't thrive and flourish by selfishly looking out for ourselves. We instead, in the great paradox of Christianity, we become more fully ourselves by giving ourselves away. We thrive not by focusing on our own selfishness, but by loving others, because ultimately we are made for love. And love doesn't just mean sexual indulgence. In fact, it usually doesn't just mean sexual indulgence. Instead, love involves the whole person. And that's what the sexual revolution ultimately denies is that the love and the flourishing of the human person mean that sex has to be concerned with the entirety of the person rather than separated off and pursued on its own terms.
Absolutely. I remember decades ago now when Father Andrew Greeley was still alive that a survey had been done of married, just adults, sexually active adults, and trying to determine who had the best sex lives, who had the most fulfilled sexual existences. And everybody was shocked when the data came back. I remember Father Greeley laughing and commenting on it. I told you so. He said, that the happiest in their sex lives were church-going Catholics. And this shocked everyone, all the sociologists, like, well, how can this be? But I think you've explained very, very clearly, how this can be, because it's a holistic message, because we have sex within the context of a much broader picture of what it means to be a human being. And it's a healthy and holistic approach. And I think there's been recent surveys now even that bear out that actually there's a direct correlation between observant religious practices, those who observe religion, and the reporting of sexually satisfied lives in a healthy and it doesn't just mean, oh, this is the best sex of my life kind of just a healthy attitude towards it.
Yeah, I think Brad Wilcox had a
Yes,
piece in First Things on that in the
yes,
last year or so.
yes, and it needs to be shouted from the rooftops that this is actually not a pathway to oppressive asceticism. It's a pathway to liberative happiness, and I take that to be. It's a really, I can't emphasize enough to my readers what a great book this is, what a timely book it is, because your point is that sexual morality matters, and opposition to the sexual revolution is something that Christians need to take up these days in the interest of our church, our society, and our own faith. Are there any issues that you wish to discuss that I haven't foregrounded here?
I mean, I think we covered it all pretty well. And yeah, the conclusion of, yeah, it's ultimately Christianity is for our good and the good of those around us.
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and persevering beyond my technological problems of a few weeks ago and not giving up. I know Ignatius Press will be happy that we've got this out. I know their publicity people are happy with this sort of thing, but it's not just because I do this for them. This is truly a great book, very readable and very timely. Dr. Nathanael Blake, Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. I urge everybody to run out and buy it, every parent especially. So thank you for being on the show today, Dr. Blake.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I enjoyed it a
Okay.
lot.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening as well. Bye now.